So here we are at the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders press day. We've been invited to test some cars, and this year we've decided to focus particularly on EVs. And I'm talking to Mike Hawes, who's the Chief Exec of the SMMT, because I'm referring back to a conversation that you and I had a year or two ago when the government first started talking about 2030 for all electric cars, and the consensus view then, and you expressed the same view and so did I, was it was going to be very difficult. Given the amount of product that we're seeing here today and the improvements in that product, are you pleasantly surprised?
Well, I think we always knew that the industry was, even then, in the process of investing. The vehicles you see here, the electric vehicles you hear, that wasn't a decision taken 1 or 2 years ago. That was taken potentially a decade ago for those development programs to flow through to result in that choice you see now. And that choice over this year and next year and beyond is going to increase as the industry moves away from petrol and diesel, which they're not really investing in, into electrification, which is great. So the choice is there for the customer, but in terms of achieving 2030, 2035, it's not just about putting the products on the market, it's about whether customers will be buying them. And that's not necessarily solely in the gift of the manufacturers.
I mean, I think the last figure I saw was something in the order of 5 to 6% of EVs and hybrids.
No, in terms of new car sales last year, about 1 in 6 cars was plugged in, which means both pure electric battery and plug-in. And about 1 in 10 was pure electric. You can add on hybrids on top of that. And so electrified vehicles, about a 22% market share, but pure electric, solely electric, about 10%, which is great. That's a good start, but we've got to get from 10% to 100%, the majority of that in the next basically 10 years.
That's going to be quite a task, and I mean days like this are certainly going to help move things forward, and hopefully we're going to be able to say, well, these are very acceptable vehicles now.
Yeah, there's increased choice. It must be said the majority of electrified vehicles tend to be in the medium to larger segments, whether they're SUVs, family cars, saloons or whatever, because the cost, and these are still a technology that is more expensive than conventional petrol and diesel. But the challenge for the industry is that we can't just sell that particular segment. We have to sell vehicles that appeal to everyone. And the biggest selling segment in the UK is traditionally A B segment. If you think Fiestas and Corsas and something like that, Polos and so forth. So it's what you do for those type of buyers, getting that technology into all different price points in the market. It's really challenging when you think about the cost of batteries. Making sure that vehicle is going to be affordable, so we can ensure that the entire new car market, the entire UK car buying public can move to these sort of technologies. That's really potentially where the biggest commercial challenge is.
And still there is a problem, I think, with the infrastructure. It's still not there and it's not progressing fast enough. It's certainly my view, and I think it's a common view. We're not building the infrastructure that's needed to support these.
It's not keeping pace. In terms of the rapid charges, those you see on the motorways, some destinations, UK is pretty good. It's one of the best in Europe from that. It's maybe not as good as some Japan, Korea and so forth, but in terms of Europe it is one of the best. Where we see the biggest shortfall is on-street charging. Now always remember that about 40% of dwellings in the UK don't have a designated car parking space. People live in terrace houses, people live in flats, apartments. There may be parking, but it's not designated to a particular dwelling. So those people are going to be dependent on-street charging, because we're creatures of convenience. We like the idea of being able to charge at home. That's why the majority of electric cars being sold now are sold to people with driveways. So what happens if you don't have a driveway? Because again, we can't just sell to those with driveway. If we're to meet the ambition, the expectation, what will be a legislated mandated target, we need everyone to be able to buy these vehicles, and charging must keep pace with that take-up.
I mean, I've seen very few on lamppost or on post or on street charging points, and some trailing cables, which is not a particularly good idea, but there just aren't enough of them.
No, it's we've done some research, and because of new car sales of electric vehicles is going like that. Yes, the number of and the investment in infrastructure is increasing, but it's increasing like that, so there's a gap. So it potentially could get worse before it gets better. What we want to see is basically commensurate targets put on the infrastructure industry to keep pace with the automotive industry, which is increasing choice and is being now demanded to increase sales of EVs on an annual basis.
Interestingly, also referring back to our conversation of a few years ago, I think when I first started driving EVs here, typical range was 30 or 40 miles. You could take the kids to school and if you were lucky, get home again. Now we're looking at hundreds of miles. In fact, the recent Mercedes 1,000 kilometres.
Yeah, when we look in the last 10 years was when we started having EVs here. The average then was about 70 miles average. Now the average of what you see today is more like 270 miles. It's increased dramatically. And that was one of the concerns a lot of consumers would have. It was about this range anxiety. Will I be able to get where I want to go? That anxiety has been replaced instead of range charging anxiety. When I get to that place, will there be somewhere for me to charge? Will it be working? How much will it cost? Will it provide sufficient charge for me to get back again? That's what we have to address to make sure there are no obstacles to the take-up of these sort of vehicles.
And will it all be so attractive when there's a consensus view that the Chancellor will realise the losses that he's going to be making on fuel duties and that he will have to recover that through the electricity used?
At some stage, government we know they're looking at it now, but because you're right, the fuel duty as you move away from petrol and diesel into electrification, that is a declining revenue. Fuel duty and vehicle excise duty contributes about £35 billion a year to the exchequer. That's a massive amount of money, and that's going to be declining. We know at some stage that's got to be replaced. But what you don't want to do is try and do something that stifles the take-up of these vehicles when everyone is trying to ensure that these vehicles are bought in ever greater numbers, because if you are to achieve the UK's net zero ambition, you need to basically address the biggest emitting segment, which is road transport. You need to do it relatively quickly. So basically road transport has to shoulder the biggest burden in delivering net zero. So you need to use every lever at your disposal to encourage customers, consumers to make the switch.
So do you have to bring back in as a government a greater incentive to buying these vehicles, and particularly an incentive in respect of commercial vehicles?
Yeah, we would like to see an extension to incentives, but if I'm honest, I don't see it happening. It's still going to be there for vans and some trucks, because that's a much more nascent industry. But I think it's quite clear the constant cuts you've seen in the plug-in car grant, ultimately you're at the stage now where only about 1 in 5 pure electric vehicles qualifies for that incentive. We know what the government's looking at, and they've now launched a consultation. Is basically having a mandate, basically demanding a significant proportion of every brand's new car sales and new van sales are electric, which is basically seeking to control the market, which is a very difficult and dangerous game. If you look at what's happened in all sorts of markets over the last 2 or 3 years, incredibly volatile, trying to forecast what's going to happen, and in such a way as you can still have a customer affordability, given this is new technology, it's a really difficult thing to do.
Okay, well, let's broaden it out a little bit, the marketplace generally, as we're hearing more and more people are going to be suffering through all kinds of financial constraints over the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months, whatever. Are we seeing a decline in the market? Do you perceive such happening?
I think it's early to say. At the moment, it's a supply-constrained market. The global shortage of semiconductors, you'll see the figures that we're putting out at the moment. Production in the UK is down, production in Europe is down, production globally is down. The shortage of semiconductors is the biggest cause of that. If you can't make your vehicles, you can't sell them. So there is, again, in terms of new car sales, it's below where it should be. We know the demand is there, and there's a degree of pent-up demand over the last 2 years. Now, as we move through this year and into yet next, cost of living increasing, inflation, fuel, energy costs in particular, undoubtedly that will put some strain on customer demand. But how that sort of plays out when you've got a supply-constrained market, you're trying to, there's two things almost that balance each other. So I don't think we will see any collapse in the market. On the contrary, we still expect the market to begin to grow, but we need the easing of the supply of semiconductors. That would make the biggest difference to the new car market.
And that certainly looks like a longer term problem.
It's certainly through this year and into next. Some recent statement says it could go on a bit longer. But again, it depends on demand and supply, not just of vehicles, but semiconductors go into other types of technologies, personal electronics, televisions, and so forth. So it's really how respective markets do, because there's a global demand for that particular product.
So, Mike, one word response: hopeful or not?
I think this year, it's not going to be more than one word, I'm afraid. We came into this year more optimistic than the last two. I mean, at least the pandemic has largely subsided, not totally, but largely. Obviously, there's the Russia-Ukraine situation and the impact that is having on the global economy, which gives everyone pause for thought.